I am seeing it, Bill.
Is it the full screen like we talked about?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jeff.
Hey, Bill, can you hear me?
Jeff?
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, somehow I noticed I got muted.
Oh, okay.
Are we good now?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Maybe we could have, if there was a number of people, thank you very much for letting us know you couldn't hear the sound. It looks like a couple of folks. Yes, sound has returned. Apologize, everyone, for that gap in our audio. And Bill, back to you.
Okay, and just to confirm, Jeff, you're seeing the presentation mode of the slides, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Awesome.
perfect. Okay, so not sure where I cut off there. I apologize, but I just wanted to point out that this is something unusual in our industry for a company to provide these presentations, webinars on a regular basis, like Orange Tree does. And so a shout out to Orange Tree for doing this. As we get close to the end of the year, they've done them on a regular basis. And if you're an Orange Tree client, you're probably a little bit spoiled, and you may not realize that this is not something a lot of other companies do. So, but it's important. It's important under any circumstances that we stay connected, that a provider like Orange Tree keep its clients up to date on emerging trends, and especially under the circumstances that we've all found ourselves in this year with the COVID-19 pandemic. So, okay, with that out of the way, let me just say, let me advance if I can. We're looking at the agenda now. Maybe not. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so we're going to go through a number of issues. Earlier this year, the Current Consulting Group conducted a survey of both drug testing providers and employers on the impact that the pandemic has had on drug testing practices. And so we're going to present the results of the employer side of that survey, but I'm going to sprinkle in some insights from the drug testing industry as well. We'll talk about the new marijuana laws. Everybody's interested in that. There were five states that passed marijuana laws on November 3rd. We're going to look at that. And the crazy new law in Oregon as well. If you haven't heard about that, you'll find that to be quite entertaining and concerning during today's presentation. And then we'll talk about some things that you might want to think about in terms of drug testing. You know, the title is employee screening in the new normal, but the normal is still evolving, and we're still trying to figure that out as a community. And so some things are going to continue to evolve and emerge, and 2021 is likely not to look anything like 2019 for sure, and maybe even some changes with the modifications that we've made in 2020. So we'll talk about all of those things, but let's first start out by talking about, oops, I went backwards for some reason there. There we go. Let's talk about the survey that we conducted. So we did it because a lot of things were changing in the way drug testing providers and alcohol screening providers were providing their services, how collections were being done. Something that's been a new trend that's becoming popular is referred to by different names, like telehealth collections, virtual drug testing, remote video observed collections. Excuse me, and we'll talk about that in detail. Also, the increasing popularity of alternative testing methods, anything to do with saliva or oral fluid, seems to be becoming more popular, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But during the survey, we got into those issues. We asked those questions, and the very first question we asked was, has there been a drop in drug testing volume since the start of the pandemic? And employers answered, as you can see in those colorful bars, on the far left, about 48% said 0 to 10%, so not a lot of change. But as you kind of go over to the right, you see that the blue bar was 11% saying that drug testing volume had dropped between 41 and 60%, and 21, almost 21.5% saying that it had dropped at least 61%. This is an interesting development, right? Because at the beginning of the year, everything was going normal. Volumes were where they were. I think most drug testing providers anticipated an increase in drug testing volume overall during 2020. But of course, COVID affected that as the unemployment levels went up and really skyrocketed to new levels. Drug testing volume, of course, crashed because a lot of drug testing is pre-employment screening. And as you see in that blue box there in the middle of the screen, 35% of the drug testing providers that we surveyed said that they had seen a drop between 41 and 60% in the volume of drug testing that they perform. So a pretty significant drop. And let me just point this out real quick. So on the employer side of the survey, you see that light blue bar off to the right. Only 11% said it had dropped between 41 and 60%. Why is the volume drop, the percentage, 35%, so much higher among providers than what the employers were saying? Well, each employer represented just his or her company when they responded to that question. With the drug testing providers, they were talking about, representing many tens of thousands of clients. So you can see why a lot more providers were indicating that there had been a volume drop in drug testing since the start of the pandemic. And the alterations to their drug testing practices were very interesting. Look at that kind of purple or dark blue wedge of the pie right at the top, right around 12 o'clock there. That was nearly 3% of employers saying that they had permanently dropped drug testing. As since the start of the pandemic, about 3% said they weren't going to do drug testing anymore, ever. They permanently dropped it. If you look to the yellow wedge to the left of it, there was about 23% that said they had temporarily halted drug testing until the end of the pandemic. Now, of course, we all thought by now the pandemic would be over. In fact, when it started, we thought it'd be over in 3 weeks, probably. And it's raging on and on and on. And as Jeff mentioned, new restrictions being implemented in states throughout the country. So we're still grappling with that. Maybe if we did this survey right now, these percentages would be a little bit different. But I also thought it was interesting as you look at that little tiny gray wedge at about 9 o'clock on the pie there, that almost 1%, about 0.75%, said they'd actually increased the volume of drug testing. Now, at the beginning of the presentation, Jeff mentioned that what Orange Tree does was deemed from the very beginning to be an essential service, and they stayed open all the time. Well, there were other essential services as well that were, going full bloom or full speed, I should say, during the pandemic at all stages. And those companies actually saw increases in hiring, and they were drug testing. It wasn't a big percentage of the overall pie, but there were some companies that were drug testing at increased volumes, despite the fact that the pandemic was closing other businesses. But an interesting thing there, if you look at the majority of the pie there is in that light blue color, indicating about 55, 56%, indicating that there had been no alteration to their drug testing practices. Now, we also asked what percentage think that drug testing will either go down, stay the same, or go up during the third and fourth quarter. Now, of course, we're well into the fourth quarter, and so some of these percentages would be a little bit different, but I'll explain why I think they're probably accurate here in a second. So about 8% said they anticipated performing fewer drug tests in the third and fourth quarter. If you go down to the bottom, 35.5% said they anticipated doing more drug tests during the third and fourth quarter, and about 56%, a little over half, said that it would be about the same. Well, the same is a relative term, right? It could be more, or it could be a lot more than last year, it could be less than last year, but they thought it would be about the same. Look in the blue box, 83% of industry providers really expected drug test volume to go up in the third and fourth quarters. So interesting that we see that comparison, right, between employers and providers. But here's the thing that you got to keep in mind. So more companies may be drug testing again now, and probably are. I would predict that it's a pretty healthy percentage that have either resumed drug testing or have increased their volume of drug testing. And we don't have data on that. We won't have that till the year is over. But we have seen the unemployment rate coming down dramatically over the last 3 to 4 months. In fact, I think just before Election Day, it went down below, I think it was 7.4%, which was, something that was, a good unemployment rate a few years ago, higher than it had been when the pandemic started, when it was around 3.5, 3.7%. But that that drop in the unemployment rate corresponds, I'm sure, to an increase in the percentages of companies conducting pre-employment drug testing. And we're going to talk about why that's important here in a second. A couple more slides on the survey, though. Are employers removing marijuana from the drug test panel? Only 5% said yes. 15% of drug testing providers, if you see in the blue box there, said that they had clients remove marijuana from their drug test panel during the pandemic. Why during the pandemic? I can't answer that question except to say that it's probably in reaction to a trend that was in place and happening before the pandemic set in. But 95% said no, they were not dropping marijuana from their drug test panel. Now keep that 5%, that little blue wedge in mind for a slide that's going to come up in the second part of this presentation. Okay, and then opinions on the sample types with the lowest risks. So what were employers saying about urine testing or oral fluid or hair as a potential risk to expose people to the virus, right? So if you're sending somebody to a collection site, they're going to be around people who have gathered at that collection site for whatever type of testing or providing of a sample, be it for a COVID test or for a drug test or for any number of types of tests that doctors will order. We show up as patients at that patient service center, at that occupational health center, and we provide a body sample. Well, is there a particular body sample that's perceived by employers to be of lesser risk than others? Well, look all the way to the right. 53% of employers, we're not referring to that blue box, we're just looking at the orange bars there. 53% of employers said they considered urine to be the lowest risk of exposure to the coronavirus versus oral fluid at 12.5% and hair at 29.5%, almost 30%. Now, if you're in the urine testing business, right, or you're a company that does urine testing, you're thinking, great, 53%, the biggest bar there on the chart, that's good news. But the flip side of it is that in January, that bar would have been probably 99%, right? So since the start of the pandemic, the perceived risk associated with urine testing has gone in the wrong direction for urine testing. But let me say that urine is typically considered a sterile sample, a sterile bodily fluid, and you're probably not, we don't know right now that you can get exposed to the coronavirus through contact with urine. In fact, to my knowledge, there are no urine COVID tests. There are urine oral fluid tests. There are COVID oral fluid tests. There are nasal oral fluid tests, of course. There are blood oral fluid tests, but not a urine oral, I'm saying that wrong. COVID testing. There's not a urine COVID test. And that has something to do with being able to detect the coronavirus in a urine sample. I think this chart will probably be adjusted when you take into consideration what is the risk of exposure. It's probably not coming into contact with somebody's urine. That's probably just not even feasible. But it could be coming in contact with somebody who's sick at a location where urine samples are being collected. And that's probably where the greatest concern lies. Now, we talked about telehealth, remote video observed collections. Some people refer to it as virtual drug testing, but this is where somebody is sitting in one location and the drug test collector / observer is in a completely different location, could be in 2 different parts of the country, right? And through some type of video platform, whether it's Zoom or Skype or some of these drug test video platforms that have come out recently, like Proof, where you're actually observing the individual providing a sample. You're viewing the entire collection process, and it's taking place by the donor. It's a donor-driven collection being observed via some video platform by the /collector observer. Now, that would be very difficult to do with urine testing, right? Because not all urine tests should be by any means an observed collection. So this is probably going to be more of a oral fluid type of test where you don't have the concern about matching the gender of the collector with the donor and things of that nature. Since the start of the pandemic, when we conducted the survey, 4% of employers said that they had inquired about virtual drug testing or telehealth, remote video observed collections. But of the providers, 17% shared that their clients have inquired about telehealth or video or remote video observed collections. So there's a trend there for sure, right? Because at the beginning of the year, it was probably less than 1% by employers and industry providers. Now it's a growing percentage. And even in the short time since we did this survey, I'm sure these percentages have gone up because we're seeing a lot more interest in it. Even the federal government is looking at the possibility of creating regulations for video observed collections. I'm not predicting it, and I'm not saying it's right around the corner by any means, but they're looking into those possibilities as a way to help employers find other means to get collections done if they're struggling to get a traditional collection of a urine sample at a offsite collection facility done. In fact, you probably have seen some guidance coming out recently from DOT, for example, about adjustments or leniency when it comes to meeting your annual random selection percentage number and other guidance that's come out from the federal government. And one of the things they're looking at is the possibility that this may be an alternative that employers can turn to if they're having trouble getting collections done. So I suspect these percentages have gone up even since we did this survey. Okay. A lot on that part on the survey, and we asked a lot of other questions. If you have any questions though about the survey results, please be prepared to ask them today. I'd be happy to help you with that. Now, one of the things that's on a lot of people's mind are the new marijuana laws that were voted in 5 different states just a couple of weeks ago. Now, this is the updated marijuana map. So Arizona, South Dakota, Montana, Mississippi, New Jersey are states that legalized marijuana either for medicinal purposes, as in Mississippi, which you see on the map is blue, or in San Diego, which actually voters approved both recreational and medical marijuana. So if a state has a recreational law, we always paint it orange. All of the orange states also have medical marijuana laws, but to distinguish them from the states that just have medical marijuana laws, we show them in orange. So Montana now has a recreational marijuana law, South Dakota does, Arizona does, and New Jersey all the way off to the right there. Mississippi just passed a medical marijuana law. And this is important, right? Because going into Election Day, there were 34 states that had legalized marijuana in one way or another, 34 states, including the District of Columbia. Now there are 39 states, including the District of Columbia, that have legalized marijuana either for recreational use or for medical use. And on Election Day, South Dakota voters actually passed both a medical marijuana and a recreational marijuana initiative. First time that's ever happened. And then Oregon actually passed a law that decriminalizes all drugs in Schedule 1 through Schedule 4 of the Controlled Substances Act. I'm going to talk about that in a minute because it's significant and it's going to have an impact on laws in other states in the near future. Let's talk about just a few of these states that passed new laws. So Arizona already had a medical marijuana law. They now have a recreational marijuana law. As you can see, nearly 60% of voters approved of it. It's like a lot of other states with recreational marijuana laws, which are sometimes referred to as adult use laws, but it's 21 and older. You're allowed to possess, consume, or transfer marijuana. You're not, that third bullet's interesting. This is actually language from the initiative, from the ballot initiative that people voted on. Driving while impaired to even the slightest degree by marijuana is strictly prohibited. But what does that mean? What's that standard? There is no standard for driving under the influence of marijuana. So a little bit ambiguous there. Marijuana in the workplace language, yes, it did contain some workplace language. Employers retain their rights to maintain drug and alcohol-free places of employment. Employers are not required to accommodate use, consumption, possession, transfer, display, transportation, sale, or cultivation of marijuana in the workplace. That's an important distinction. And there's nothing in the law that employers are not restricted in their ability to prohibit or regulate conduct that's allowed by the new law, which was Proposition 207. So this is an interesting development in Arizona because it's somewhat blank on a lot of topics that would be of concern to an employer in Arizona. What about drug testing? What about reacting to a positive result? What about testing job applicants for marijuana? And what about denying employment to an applicant who fails a drug test for marijuana? This is something that a lot of other states have grappled with. Marijuana passed a medical marijuana, Mississippi passed a medical marijuana law fairly convincingly, but it doesn't say anything about the workplace. So Mississippi is an example of a state that did not have any type of legal marijuana law prior to Election Day. They passed medical marijuana, but the medical marijuana law that was passed says nothing about the workplace. Montana approved recreational marijuana. You can see there's a lot about the workplace in the Montana Initiative 190. Basically, it's sort of the stuff that we're used to seeing. Employers are not required to permit or accommodate recreational marijuana in the workplace or on work property, which includes vehicles that are owned by and used for work purposes. Employers can discipline employees for the violation of a workplace drug and alcohol policy, underscoring the importance of the policy and what the policy says about marijuana. Every policy that we write now, and this has been the case for about 5 years now, has a dedicated marijuana section in it because it's different state by state. So it's important that if you're a multi-state employer that you're addressing marijuana according to the laws that apply to you. If you're in multiple states, all of the laws in all of those states apply to your program. So you've got to be careful on that, and it's got to be in your policy, even if it requires you to put in some amendments to the policy to cover different restrictions or protections that may be in one state but not found in another state. Interesting here, we're going to talk about this in a couple of other states as well. Employers can discipline employees for working while intoxicated by marijuana, but there is no standard. Again, there is no standard for determining intoxication or impairment by marijuana. In Colorado, for example, the THC content, the tetrahydrocannabinol content, the psychoactive ingredient of marijuana that causes people to feel high, in Colorado, it's very common for that to have about a 17 to 20% THC level in the marijuana that's sold legally in the state of Colorado. That's a very high percentage of THC compared to the marijuana that people smoked in the 70s when it was less than 3%. And so depending on the kind of marijuana you're using, what the THC level is in that marijuana, one joint could get you blasted in one area, whereas in another area with a weaker THC strain, you're looking at maybe 3 or 4 joints before you get the same kind of high out of it. And so any kind of language referring to intoxication or impairment caused by marijuana is really almost useless, except for the employer can do other things to determine impairment in the workplace, not simply relying on a drug test. You could do some type of impairment testing. Pupillary exam testing, I think, will become popular in the future because of a lot of marijuana laws that refer to intoxication or impairment, which the drug test is not necessarily going to tell you. Employers can deny employment to an applicant for violation of the policy. So again, you have to have it in your policy that if somebody fails a pre-employment drug test, one of the consequences will be the fact that they'll be denied employment. And then how long before they can reapply if they want to for a position with that company where they failed that drug test. And employers can take adverse employment action against an individual, an employee, based on the violation of the drug and alcohol policy. Not necessarily the drug and alcohol test, but the policy itself. So let me just stay on that topic for 1 second. So if a drug test doesn't legally prove impairment, in other words, if an employee is fired because they failed a drug test and you said as a result of failing the drug test, we're declaring that you are impaired on the job, and then legally it goes through some type of a legal challenge and it's determined that legally the drug test result didn't prove impairment. What you need in that situation is a drug policy that basically doesn't rely on the drug test as proof of impairment, but other conditions that maybe led to the drug test, reckless behavior in the workplace, ongoing tardiness to work, or days missed without excuses, and any number of other things that maybe led to the drug test in the first place. Those become the actions upon which the employer takes adverse employment action against an individual. The drug test is a violation of the policy that goes hand in hand with these other observed behaviors that together give the employer the right to go ahead and take adverse employment action. Montana also passed a constitutional initiative that amended the state constitution to establish the age of 21 as the minimum age that somebody could legally use marijuana in that state. New Jersey's an interesting situation. Public question 1 was passed by 67% of the voters, overwhelmingly, right? Which approves recreational marijuana. I read that passage ahead of time because I wrote an article for a client on it. There was nothing in public question number 1 about the workplace. There was no guidance for employers like we just saw in Montana. So what does an employer do? Well, in New Jersey, there is a very detailed medical marijuana law that contains a very full section about the workplace. And so the possibility exists that some of those restrictions and protections that exist in the medical marijuana law in New Jersey will probably be applied to the recreational marijuana law. We don't know that yet. It'll take some legal action going down the road and some challenges to various employer programs before we know for sure, but that's what I'm suspecting will happen. If you're in a state that has a recreational marijuana that says nothing about the workplace, then make sure you check the state's medical marijuana law to see if there's workplace language in that law. Like New Jersey, there probably is, and that would be the guidance that you would use to make sure that you have a legally compliant law in the state of New Jersey, or any other state for that matter. South Dakota passed both a medical marijuana and a recreational law. Just go down to that second from the bottom bullet. Individuals are prohibited from operating motor vehicles while under the influence. However, and this is something you see in a lot of legal marijuana laws, a medical marijuana user, now this is medical marijuana, isn't considered under the influence solely because of marijuana metabolites that appear in insufficient quantities to cause impairment. Again, we don't know what insufficient quantities means. There is no standard. And so that's something that we're gonna be looking at in the coming months and years as some of these laws go into effect and are challenged by employers. The medical marijuana law in South Dakota does contain some marijuana or workplace language relative to marijuana, and it's not unlike what we see in a lot of other states. Employers are not required to permit employees to use marijuana at work, to work while under the influence, although that's a little bit of a loose term in terms of marijuana impairment in the workplace. But again, look at that last bullet. Qualified medical marijuana patients are not to be considered under the influence solely because of the presence of marijuana metabolites or components that appear in insufficient concentration to cause impairment. Now, look at the situation from a scientific standpoint. In a urine test, it takes some period of hours for the body to break down the marijuana that's in the system so that metabolites of the parent drug, the marijuana, can be detected in a urine sample. In blood, you can detect the parent drug. Therefore, in a blood sample, marijuana is detectable within minutes after somebody has used a drug, unlike urine, where we're waiting for metabolites to become detectable. Oral fluid mimics blood. And so we're not testing in an oral fluid sample for a metabolite of marijuana, although when metabolites become detectable, they're detectable in a lab-based oral fluid test. But we're looking for the parent drug itself, the marijuana itself, which becomes detectable within minutes after use. This may be important to know if you're in one of these states that has very restrictive language in terms of what you can do with a drug test result. If you're going to try to tell somebody that the test shows that they're impaired, legally, scientifically, not really possible to do that, but you have a greater argument to make if you're using a test result like blood or oral fluid that has the ability to detect very, very recent use of the drug within minutes after somebody's used the drug. Of course, with a hair sample, we're talking about, you know, weeks, a good 7 to 10 days before a drug becomes detectable in a hair sample. Now, South Dakota also passed recreational marijuana. You see the language down there, very similar to what we've seen in other states. And then Oregon. I just wanted to make sure I left enough time to talk about Oregon because a lot of people aren't familiar with the new Oregon law. Measure 109 legalizes psilocybin. Okay, psilocybin is like magic mushrooms. Okay, and so there's a decriminalization and a permitting of the manufacture and sale of psilocybin producing mushrooms. DC, Washington DC passed a similar law on election day as well. But Oregon went one big giant step beyond that by allowing voters to approve a measure 110, that decriminalizes all drugs in Schedule 1 through Schedule 4 of the Controlled Substances Act. That means now in Oregon, heroin, cocaine, meth, synthetic opioids like hydrocodone, oxycodone are all decriminalized in the state of Oregon now. And so if you're found in possession of what's considered a personal use quantity of any of those drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc., it's punishable by a fine of up to $100, not necessarily $100, and possibly a requirement for a health assessment through an addiction recovery center. So it doesn't necessarily say, if you read the law carefully in Oregon, it doesn't necessarily say that an individual will have an assessment, but it does say that if they're in possession of just enough for personal use and they're not trafficking or selling or distributing the drug, then it's no longer a crime in the state of Oregon. This mimics laws that have been passed in other countries, like Portugal, for example. I'm pointing this out because during the presidential campaign, during the primaries, there were some candidates that actually came out and said that they would legalize all drugs if they were elected president. And so there's a movement in that direction. Oregon, the first state to actually do this. There will be legal challenges, I'm sure, especially from the federal government, but here's the first movement in that direction by any state in the country. Okay, and as I mentioned, DC also passed a psilocybin type of drug law that decriminalizes magic mushrooms, put it that way. Okay, we're getting close on time. Let me take you through just a couple of things real quickly as we go to the end of our presentation today. I want to leave time for questions as well. Coming into the year, marijuana use had increased dramatically over the last 5 years, but between 2018 and 2019, that orange bar at the top represents the 2019 statistics, which became available in 2020. But you can see that we went up from 15.9% to 17.5%. And while psychotherapeutic drugs like antidepressants and things of that nature actually went down slightly, marijuana went up dramatically. The age group in which there's the highest percentage of marijuana users is between 18 and 25, and you can see that percentage has gone up from 7.2 million, about 20.8% in 2016, to 7.7 million, about 23% in 2019. I only point that out because the age group that had the highest unemployment rate during the really height of the pandemic was this 18 to 25-year-old group. So as the unemployment rate is coming down, we're hiring a lot of people from that demographic, and they have the highest rate of marijuana use in the country. These are the industries that have seen the highest rate of positive drug test increases over the last 5 years. So this is not a percentage of how many tests are positive in these industries, but the percentage increase over the last 5 years. And you can see that accommodations and food services, retail, and other services have seen a pretty big increase in positive drug test results. Now, remember that wedge of the pie that I referred to where 5% of companies were saying that they had dropped marijuana? We asked those companies, those employers, why did you drop marijuana from your drug test panel? 33% said it was because marijuana testing was not permitted in their state. And that's the height of misinformation there, because marijuana testing or testing for marijuana in a workplace setting is legal in all 50 states. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions on the subject of marijuana, especially as it relates to the workplace. But just to emphasize that point, testing for marijuana is still legal in all 50 states. There may be some states that have some restrictions in place. So for example, there are a lot of different types of employee protection languages that are being included in some of these laws, but there are also employer protection segments that are included in many of these marijuana legalization laws. In Nevada, for example, it's unlawful for an employer in the state of Nevada to fail or refuse to hire a prospective employee because that individual submitted to a drug test and tested positive for marijuana. In other words, you can't refuse, you cannot refuse to hire somebody on a pre-employment screening process in Nevada simply because they tested positive for marijuana. You can't use that positive marijuana test as the sole reason for not hiring somebody. Somebody could show up high on marijuana for a job interview, and when you test them and they test positive, that can't be the reason why you don't hire them. New York City actually has the most restrictive law when it comes to marijuana. It prohibits all pre-employment testing for marijuana, period, throughout the entire city, with the exception of a list of pre-approved list of safety sensitive occupations, like firemen and policemen and law enforcement and things of that nature. Those types of safety sensitive occupations, you can still conduct a pre-employment test for marijuana, but generally no, very restrictive in marijuana. And then just a few weeks ago, a Pennsylvania court ruled that employees can sue employers for a new area of law that we didn't even know existed that long ago, called medical marijuana bias. And we're going to find out more about that as it's used by attorneys to try to get their employees hired in places where they failed a drug test. But it's where you're going to accuse the employer of showing bias against an individual simply because they're a medical marijuana user. And we've seen cases like this in Arizona, Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island, where they've also ruled the same way when it comes to that. You're going to get all of these slides, so don't worry that I'm going kind of quick here at the end, because I do want to get to some questions, and I want to try to wrap this up in the next minute. But you're going to have all of these slides so you can look at all the details when it comes to what do these accommodation laws look like for medical marijuana. It doesn't mean that you can't test for marijuana. It doesn't mean that you should drop marijuana from your drug test panel. It does mean that a positive marijuana test on its own cannot be the sole basis for workplace discipline. And you really do need to have your policy in place and make sure your supervisors, who are really sort of carrying out your policy on a day-to-day basis, have been trained and retrained in the signs and symptoms of substance abuse and somebody who's under the influence or impaired. We know that positive drug test results for marijuana are at an all-time high, a 16-year high in 2020. Permitting marijuana impairment, though, in the workplace because you're afraid to deal with it or you think you don't have the legal right to test for it or do anything about it, is a dangerous position to take. It exposes your company to increased liability. And there's a couple of areas of law. Let me see, I think it's right here. So there's two areas of law that come into place. One is called negligent hiring, and the other is respondeat superior. Respondeat superior basically says, in layman's terms, and that's all I can speak on in it, is that you as the employer are responsible for the behavior and the acts of your employees when they're operating within the scope of employment. So if they're driving a vehicle in the scope of their employment, delivering something, picking somebody up, dropping somebody off, but it's within the scope of their employment, and they're high on marijuana and they cause an accident, you're going to be held responsible as the employer, even if marijuana is legal in the state where you conduct business. Negligent hiring is a little bit different. It imposes liability on employers when an employee commits an intentional tort, but most often outside of the scope of employment. And there's an example there below that. So that's a lot all at once. There's a lot in the presentation about drug testing, but just so you know, all the testing methods that were available before the pandemic, such as lab-based urine testing, POCT urine testing, hair testing, which is always through a lab, lab-based oral fluid testing, and POCT oral fluid testing, they're all still in common practice today. Urine testing has probably taken a little bit of a hit since the start of the pandemic just because collections have been a challenge, but it's still there. It's still a viable, reliable, legally defensible drug testing method, as are the other testing methods. And I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit in closing and say that last year in October, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, issued final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. So there's a gold standard out there that employers can use, whether they're covered under DOT regulations or not, for lab-based oral fluid testing. Just a few weeks ago, it's probably been more than a few weeks now, but time is passing so quickly, SAMHSA came out with a notice of proposed rulemaking, an NPRM, for hair testing. And so in the near future, not next year probably, but by 2022 and 2024 or 5 for hair testing, you're going to see finalized regulations in use, implemented, and available to use for federally mandated drug testing programs. Even though the SAMHSA regulations don't automatically approve testing for DOT circumstances for hair and oral fluid, I think in the next 2 to 4 years, you're going to see DOT come out with its own regulations for both hair and oral fluid, and all 3 major testing methods, urine, hair, and oral fluid, through a laboratory will be permitted for compliance with the DOT regulations. Now, Jeff, I've got a few more slides, but I think we're running out of time and we may want to get to some questions. Let me ask you, how are we looking?
You know, you're right on target, Bill. We do have a few minutes. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and I'll just invite the audience while we go through the first couple. If something's on your mind that you want to ask Bill, please submit that into the chat window, and we'll make sure that we either have a chance to answer it online, time permitting, or if for any reason whatsoever we happen to run out of time, we will follow up with you following today's webinar. So Bill, thank you first and foremost for that information. There's a lot in that deck, and so just the handouts there for download, everybody. And we will have a recording also, so feel free if you want to listen to it again or share it with friends or others in your organization to please do so. There's a ton of content here. One question I have, just, and we kind of started the conversation here a little bit, and maybe it's a good bookend. There's a number of workplace, you know, the quote unquote in the workplace sort of direction to employers, given this remote world we're now in. What does that mean?
Well, okay, I'm going to give you my opinion, but I think it's probably going to be very accurate. I think the future of drug testing will look very different than how it looked in 2019. And the reason I say that is the pandemic has sort of, excuse me, the pandemic has sort of forced us into a corner as employers to try to continue to maintain our drug-free workplace programs. And I'm an employer too, I have employees. And at the same time, work around all the crazy restrictions and other applications that have been affected by the COVID pandemic. And so we've looked to remote drug testing, or remote collections and virtual drug testing. We looked to saliva alcohol testing to avoid asking people to provide a deep lung air sample for an EBT and for an evidentiary breath test. I don't think EBTs are going away. I just think that there's a movement by a percentage of employers that want to do it with saliva. And of course, saliva alcohol testing is permitted under the DOT regulations as long as you use an approved device. But a very interesting thing that we've noticed is that some employers are indicating in a very new survey that we just did, where we don't even have the results all tabulated yet, that some of the movement towards saliva alcohol testing or oral fluid drug testing or remote video observed collections, virtual drug testing, are actually practices that employers like. And so maybe they might never have considered these alternatives under the old circumstances, but being forced to look for different ways to get drug test collections done and drug testing in general, a lot of employers are finding that some of these alternatives are as good as what they were doing. They're comfortable with it. And the other thing, Jeff, that's really important is that it takes a lot for a company to try to alter the way that they do anything, let alone drug testing. But once they make those efforts to change, it takes a monumental effort to go back to the way it was. And so I think you'll see a lot of companies looking at keeping these alternative testing methods in place simply as another way of doing it. Maybe it's a combination say urine testing and oral fluid testing, or urine testing and hair testing, and virtual collections and traditional collections. But I think the new normal for the industry and for the employers that use our screening services is going to look very different than the past. And I don't think we're going to go back to the way it was entirely anytime soon, because I think the pandemic's going to rage on in one way or another for months to come.
The information in Oregon, what the voters passed their legislation and whatnot. California in the background screening business really is kind of a bellwether for what happens. It moves back east and maybe it comes together in the middle. It starts from Massachusetts on the other coast. So they're kind of bellwether states. Oregon and what they just passed, your experience in the industry, is that a bellwether state? Should we expect that this is going to cascade across our country, or I mean, is it too, what do you make of that, if anything, at this point?
Well, it's significant. Now, Oregon is a state, and I mean no offense to anybody in Oregon. I've spoken at conferences there on a number of occasions, and I'm always treated very nicely. But Oregon is so liberal on these types of issues that that's a perfect state to try to get a law like this passed. And so that's why they did it in Oregon. I think it's going to become a model for other states that tend to be very, very liberal on these types of issues. So California, Washington, Colorado, we can expect to see similar initiatives in the near future. I'm not predicting in 2021, but as these things come up, I think, and I don't think the lawmakers will create legislation. I think that on these ones, because it's so controversial, I think it will probably always be a voter type of initiative. But I think you'll see it in California, Washington, and Colorado for sure. Those were the real bellwether states when it came to marijuana. I think they'll also be the next group of states to look at an Oregon type of law to decriminalize all drugs.
Okay. I have a question on remote drug testing. The kind of a general comment, it seems like it would be difficult to monitor a remote drug test, and possibly the candidate would be able to use someone else's sample. Maybe you could just comment on that just the process, the plausibility of what was described, and then maybe there's a solution to that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it comes up a lot. So if you're doing, say, an oral fluid collection via a remote video observed platform like Zoom or Skype or something like that, you're watching the entire collection process take place. And so it's not really possible for somebody to use somebody else's oral fluid sample when you're literally watching them put the swab in their mouth, wait the required number of minutes to saturate it, and then put that swab into the vial that's going to be sent into the laboratory. That's not really a concern. But for some employers, to make sure that that doesn't happen, that cheating doesn't occur, there are some programs where you can that are designed specifically for drug testing, where you can actually also video record the entire process take place, including the filling out of the forms and the packaging of the sample in the shipping package and the whole process. And then that gets uploaded to a central server, and then it's available to you if you need it for any purpose. If a drug test gets challenged or the process gets challenged, you can go to that video of the collection process. Still a very new area of what the industry does for providers, but I think it's going to grow in use in the future. And part of the reason I say that is because it's already being used in other markets, like drug treatment, for example. Very common in drug treatment to use video observed collections where the two individuals can't be in the same location for a number of different reasons. And so they've been using video observed collections for some time in treatment. And I think we'll see, and in insurance, that's another big market for video observed collections, because oftentimes the two individuals can't be in the same location. You may be applying for a policy with a company on the other side of the country, and they don't have somebody in your zip code to come in and help you with that. And so they've resorted to video observed collections the virtual drug testing. Very popular in insurance and in drug treatment, and I think that's why we're seeing it in workplace, because it's already established in other markets.
Interesting. So there's a follow-on question, same exact topic. So the candidate sucks on some hard candy or does something, takes something. Are there things that the candidate could do to somehow change the results of the test?
With oral fluid, for example, very difficult. Sucking on a candy isn't going to alter the composition of a saliva sample. But if you're following the instructions with, with the OraSure test or with the Quest test, or a number of companies that provide oral fluid testing through laboratories, and you're waiting the prescribed number of minutes before you put the swab in your mouth, then that eliminates any concern about somebody having put something in their mouth to try to mask the presence of drugs in the saliva. Very, very rare that that could happen anyway. There have been a number of different studies that have been done. And on one website, I did a presentation on drug test cheating just recently, and on one website, the best advice they had for somebody to pass a saliva test was, don't let them have your saliva if you've been using drugs within the last 24 hours. So not a lot out there when it comes to cheating on an oral fluid test. I'm not saying it can't happen, but if you follow the instructions with any of the major oral fluid testing products that are on the market, probably almost impossible, but let's just say very unlikely that somebody could successfully cheat on a oral fluid test.
Okay, very good. Maybe a final question for today, Bill. And a lot of our clients, a lot of businesses are in their kind of annual planning process to get ready for the new year, business policy and whatnot. Are there, given the developments and looking forward with what we know, are there a couple bottom line messages that people should be thinking about today?
Yeah, there are. I know there's a lot of confusion among employers about what they can and can't do. Do these legal marijuana laws really handcuff them and prevent them from being able to test for marijuana and things of that nature? So one, I would say keep drug testing. Drug testing has proven to be a very effective way of helping to control the negative impact of drug abuse in the workplace. It's a powerful deterrent, if nothing else, but it's also a very effective way of identifying people who need help. Keep drug testing, and by all means, keep doing pre-employment drug testing. Of all the drug testing that you can do, keep doing pre-employment testing, because as the unemployment rate continues to drop after an extended period of months in which substance abuse has skyrocketed, you don't want to be hiring people without screening them for drugs first. And there's other screening, employee screening practices like background checks, for example, that you should be including as well. But definitely keep drug testing, keep testing for marijuana, and keep conducting pre-employment drug testing. All of those things are legal in every state. There's been no change to the legal status of drug testing. There may be some restrictions in some marijuana-friendly states, so check the laws, but know that as an employer, you have the right in every state to prohibit people from being under the influence of marijuana while on the job.
Bill, thank you very much for that advice and for those closing thoughts. It's good to be grounded in what is legal versus what is maybe trending at societal levels. And of course, our employers have to wrestle with how do they meet both ends and produce work for their respective businesses. So thank you, everyone, for your attendance today. Just a quick reminder, there's a handout to download. We'll send out an email with the webinar recording, share with your friends, colleagues. And if you happen to have any questions that we didn't answer today, something comes up as you're reviewing this material, by all means, send that to us at Orange Tree. We'll be delighted to answer your questions, provide the information that you're looking for. And Bill, thank you again for the work that you do, the information that you provided, and for your partnership with Orange Tree. It's greatly appreciated. Wish everyone a fantastic day. Enjoy your Wednesday.